So, Charles, thank you so much for joining us. Says explain the deep drivers of the Chinese full employment policy is key here, and insights welcome. And what are you seeing now in terms of the employment? Not really the reported employment because those are not reliable, right? But what you're seeing from the actuals with your little spy network, your James Bonds within China.
Like you say, in an ocean of terrible Chinese data, the unemployment data are the very worst. I mean, it's just terrible. That's always this static number. It means very little. It's created out of a subset of full employment. So, you can basically say these official numbers as they're being used are useless. What we're seeing in China Beige Book data, somewhat consensus, except that we have seen things get continually better. They improved in the industry side first. We are seeing services and retail employment improve over the last several months. So they're lagging. So employment's getting better, but they're nowhere near the 2019 numbers. So this is something that we've just been hitting over and over and over and over, a point that we're stressing just so much. You're seeing a recovery in China. You're seeing it across so many metrics. You may be seeing the best big country recovery in the world. They're doing a great job overall, but they're not back at least in the data we've seen so far, they're not back to where they were in 2019. So you could see, they put all these GDP numbers and all these other metrics suggesting that very early on, the party had vanquished the virus, had sort of conquered coronavirus and gotten things up, not just to year-on-year levels, but 3.2% GDP just a few months later, and 5% for the year, and you've got all these numbers showing that things in 2020 were better in 2019. That was evident. Nowhere in our 2020 data did we see year-on-year improvement. We saw improvement. We saw a recovery, but we did not see year-on-year improvement. We're anxiously waiting. We're just days away from getting, Q1 data for 2021. Want to see what that looks like. Certainly, there has been a recovery in our January, February data. Things have been getting better. Things have been getting more even in terms of recovery, which is good. Employment's been improving, particularly, even in manufacturing, which is getting a lot of bad headlines, and so. So you're seeing an improvement. You're just not seeing a return to normalcy. You're not seeing a return to 2019 numbers. So I think that's something to keep in mind. They're going to keep posting numbers that suggest that they're back, and they're not. And that's going to affect policy, even though they don't admit it. The last part of the unemployment equation, which I don't want to glance over too quickly, is the floating migrant population. And what happens with a lot of these workers who are not formal and sort of this floating population of workers, they're not counted in a lot of unemployment statistics. So a lot of the time when we were seeing improvement early on in the coronavirus recovery, so maybe last spring 2020, there was an enormous drop off where sort of all of industry and the economy basically shut down, most of it shut down. And then there was hiring back. And, the Chinese were announcing these big numbers in terms of labor market improving. A lot of what happens is they don't count migrant workers being taken off the employment lists, off the payrolls. They're sort of, they're put in hiatus, but when they come back on, they count them as additions to the labor force. We've tried to make very clear patterns between what we're seeing in China Beige Book and labor data and what the Chinese announcements are, either qualitatively or through the unemployment numbers. And there doesn't seem to be a direct trend. I mean, it leads us to believe that Beijing is making some of this stuff up as it goes along. But there's this huge floating population that is not counted in employment statistics. So they could talk about 5.5% unemployment rates all they want, but that's not showing what the real unemployment rate is in China, even if they hit it, which they haven't hit it. So it's really difficult, really, really difficult to do labor market tracking inside the Chinese economy, particularly outside tier 1 cities.
I was unfamiliar until now, right? Because I'm like a student here. I don't know, and you're the professor. This is what you do so well, right? Is I wasn't aware that they had such a large floating immigrant. What do you call floating immigrant migration?
Floating migrant population. They work with workers who, it's based around the idea that the hukou is what anchors you. The permit, the work permit is sort of what anchors you to a particular locale, and it gives you the rights to put your children in school, and it gives you the rights to get welfare basically services, county services, provincial services, et cetera. They're reforming that because it's been a big problem for them over the past couple of decades. But you have these floating populations which are just not tracked, and that makes it very hard to track, the volatility in the data, because the Chinese won't announce it.
And so when you're seeing the employment, are you seeing it in mainland industries so there's light manufacturing, right? Then there's heavy manufacturing, such as telecom equipment, everything that's made for exporting, right? All the heavy stuff is made for exporting. But then we're seeing also that they make a lot of mattresses, they make a lot of home furnishings. So are you seeing across the board an improvement in their manufacturing and employment, or are you seeing it very product family specific, where people are just staying home more, so they're buying more couches and they're buying more furnishings for their home? Yeah,
now we're seeing it broad-based. So when we were discussing this probably last time, or I don't remember how much we got into it, but the claim that Beijing is making is, look, everything's just getting better. And yeah, there's somewhat of an uneven recovery, but things are really progressing well. Well, the recovery that Beijing was often talking about was the recovery that we were seeing, but we were only seeing it, in the very biggest cities, Beijing, Shanghai. We were seeing it in Guangdong, and so the tier one giants at large firms, they were seeing the type of dynamics, more production, more borrowing, more hiring, that Beijing was claiming was happening all across China. When we looked outside those tier one locales, you did not see that. And, I think one of the most dramatic statistics we saw in the middle of 2020 last year was borrowing in the top three, the Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangdong, was triple the level that we were seeing in the rest of the country, the other 5 regions that we were tracking. So much was going on in the bigger cities, but the recovery, if there's one word to describe it, wasn't strong as much as it was uneven. So you had industry leading, you had large firms leading, you had tier one cities leading, and everything else was falling behind. To Beijing's credit, we are seeing a much healthier recovery right now. And so when we're looking at our January, February data, which of course you have to take with a grain of salt because of Chinese New Year and some other distortions. But we were seeing retail really, really pick up its pace. It's been the laggard all year long. Consumption has been hurting domestically in China. It was a supply side recovery, but you saw retail really pick up. Services is okay. Wasn't exploding. There's a little bit of weakness there. So you were seeing a lot of the inequities that we saw throughout 2020 were being evened out in the more recent data. Which is cause for optimism. I mean, you're coming off a very difficult shutdown or partial shutdown of the economy. So that's positive.
When you say it's cause for optimism, I'm not that optimistic about that. When you say it's cause
relative optimism.
So is that again a leading indicator for what is an improvement around the world in Europe, which has become an increasingly a large consumer, and that's because you have countries like Montenegro where you've really had the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road has really kind of stayed away from Western Europe, but now we've seen it kind of encroaching into Montenegro. Germany, I think, just announced a joint investment between the German government and China, that they were going to select some industries and invest together, which was really going to be in heavy machinery, telecom equipment that would displace their own Ericsson and Nokia. So is China improvement, does that mean that America is becoming more vulnerable to those type of shocks, or Europe is becoming more vulnerable? What's the downstream of that?
I just think so much of it has to do with the COVID recovery. So if we are on the glide path to normalcy by the fall in the United States and Europe and other places, then yeah, there are certainly signs from China that will be helpful in understanding where we're heading, particularly with all this enormous amount of stimulus coursing through the system. But again, it's so much of it has to do with COVID. I mean, the Chinese handled COVID differently than everybody else did, and there's a lot to criticize in the way they did it, but there's a lot to applaud from a strictly pragmatic sense that they shut it down. Did they have more infections and deaths than they admit? Of course they did, but they took care of the problem in a way that Americans and Europeans and others did not. So some of this may be a leading indicator for what's happening in the rest of the world, but only if coronavirus takes care of itself on the trajectory we're all hoping.
Okay, so it's my last follow-up question to Chuck's because it brings up so many interesting points. In 2019, we were on the mainland, we were seeing a lot of protest. We were seeing a lot of wage labor inflation. We were seeing the effects of devalued yuan, right? And we were also seeing so many bankruptcies, just tens of thousands of Chinese companies going bankrupt, and their banking system process is a little bit different there. They create these municipal receiverships, everything that you know. Now everybody knows it, right? But they were compelling lenders, creditors to continue lending out to their defaulting debtors just to keep people employed. And at the same time, wages were going up. The yuan was going down. Their imports in their heavy industries was just getting crushed. So are we going to now see a return to those same problems that happened in 2009? Have those been ironed out now? Are we going to see wage labor inflation over there and a return to the protests? Because there was just massive, violent protests going on in the mainland about people, their livelihood being imperiled.
Yeah, I don't think so in the short term, at least. But one of the benefits of running a data firm is that we're going to be able to track this in real time. And so I have my own views of where I think things are headed. Certainly, I'm less worried about the short term. I think that there's so much stimulus coursing through the system that, yeah, there's a worry about inflation, but I'm less worried about popular protests and other things right now. But again, this is something that we track and we're going to be watching very closely. And so I don't want to get ahead of what our data say over the course of the next couple of months and years. But look, there's a lot to worry about. I mean, if you look at what the message was from the National People's Congress recently, it was basically that we're setting a very light, weak, and ambiguous GDP target of above 6%, which everyone thought was going to be higher if they announced one. But we're also talking a whole lot about fixing the economy from an environmental standpoint, and we're talking about deleveraging and dealing with debt. So what do we believe? I mean, do we believe that they're going to be able to thread the needle? I think they think they're going to try to thread the needle, at least at the beginning. But the problem is when if you deliver too much and all of a sudden you create a frosty investment environment and capital doesn't want to come in, then you have political problems and you have to sort of let the pedal up and allow more growth and allow more stimulus. And so every time we've seen policy pronouncements on deleveraging, we haven't believed them, and we've been right. Because if you look back at our data, and we track this real closely, 2016 to 2018, the Chinese talked so much about all this deleveraging they did. There was no deleveraging campaign. There was a deleveraging campaign. There was no deleveraging. There was slower additional leveraging. They did some things on the debt side. They cracked down on shadow finance. I mean, that's clear as day in our data. I mean, they did do that. They did deal with risks inside the system. They just weren't deleveraging. If you're being strict on what the definition of deleveraging means. Now, what's interesting in our January and February data is we did see what we termed, and we went back and forth internally on how to term this, early tentative evidence of deleveraging. So we are seeing a policy that's much less aggressive, obviously, than 2020, but also it's less aggressive than what we've seen in earlier January 20 sort of opening months of the year. So it's possible that we're starting to see some real push towards deleveraging. The question is, how long are we going to see it? And when they start feeling pain, because everyone's going to feel pain at some point, do they let up or do they keep going? And the answer has always been they let up, but it would be nice if they kept going.